From RFN Studios, this is Radio Free Norfolk.
Hey, today, September 2nd, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and we're joined today by a very special guest, Jason Pankratz, PhD. Dr. Pankratz, thanks for stopping by and talking to us today.
Thanks for having me. This is really exciting.
So I know you're very much into military history and did some work with the Royal Canadian Legion. Why don't you tell our listeners about your background?
Sure. I grew up in Tillsonburg, and I currently live there, so I'm proud to be part of that community. I went to Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo and studied history and fine art. After that, knowing that I wanted to become a teacher, I was accepted at Western for Teachers College and completed that program, and then ended up teaching back in my hometown in Tillsonburg, working with the public school, high school, and then the adult education sector. And I continued my education by doing my master's, focusing on arts, and then ended up doing my doctorate of education, completing that a couple years ago, focusing on community organizations, in particular places of culture, so museums, legions, and so on.
And what led you to get involved with veterans issues? Did you have veterans in your family? Or
Unbeknownst to me, it wasn't until my kind of higher education that I did find out that we had veterans in our family from the First World War, which was fascinating. But I had a teacher, Robin Barker James, at Glendale when I was a student in Tillsonburg, and he was an advocate for history, social, military, and veterans. So it was through him I was able to connect with the veterans in our community, and that's how I was then connected with our Legion, and just it's all about the storytelling and the listening and the passing on of that information.
Right. Now you served on the executive?
I did. I was on the executive, and I was vice president of Branch 153 Varnavere in Tillsonburg, as well as holding other offices, service officer, ways and means, and just kind of course, it's a community within the community. So you do everything.
Now, you had told me previously that you had escorted some of the veterans to the 60th anniversary of DDay, the celebrations in Normandy. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, that was a fantastic opportunity. Not just the whole educational side, but just the remembrance side for me, something that I've continually told my students and my friends, just the experiences. It was 2004, and we had a bus tour throughout northern France, and we were part of the 60th anniversary D-Day celebration at Juno Beach. We had a number of Second World War vets with us, and many of them, it was their first time back. One of the quick stories that comes to mind is my friend who's since passed away, Doug Vidler. He was in the second wave on D-Day, and it was just he and I who were walking down on the beach about 2 days before the celebration, and he stopped, and he pointed up the coast, and he said, "See that house there?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "That's where I came in."
Oh, wow.
So he was literally seeing the place where he entered the beach for the first time since he was on that beach.
That's one of the sad things, is that every day we're losing more and more of the Second World War veterans. I mean, to be honest, you'd have to be in your 90s now, probably, if you'd seen some action right in the Second World War.
Yes.
And it reminds me of when I was a little kid. I remember there were still a few First World War veterans around, but they were well into their 90s. And I think we're losing part of that history now because we're losing our veterans. And I think it's important for people like yourself to keep carrying on those stories. Mm-hmm. I was looking at some numbers today, and they said that there was estimated 75 million killed, both military and civilian.
Wow.
An estimated 70 million that served in the military on all sides. So, I mean, when you just think about the sheer scale of it, obviously the most destructive conflict in the history of the world.
I think on that note, I've had students say, and other people in our community, why isn't the Legion a big factor now? It used to be so big. Mm-hmm. And my response is, during the post-World War I, but primarily the Second World War years, your whole community was part of that. You had so many, you knew everybody who had served and had returned. So your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, your neighbors, everybody was connected. So that was such a thriving factor in the community. It was a community of veterans, and we just don't have that as much anymore.
Yeah, my dad told me, he, growing up in 1950s, 1960s Ontario, he said virtually every single one of his friends' fathers had served in some capacity. Yes. In one branch or another, or, maybe not necessarily overseas, but they had all been in the military during the Second World War. It was just kind of, it's a given, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, nowadays, it's what a totally different world we have in Canada today. Of course, we have our veterans that have served overseas in peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan and other places, but it's a very small minority compared to what it would have been, growing up in the 1950s and 60s. What do you think is the most important thing that this generation need to learn about the importance of the Second World War?
I would say, just as we're talking about, I think it's the idea of remembrance and the scope. Some people know people who are in the armed forces, or again, policing or firefighting and emergency services. But really the scope of the number of people who went. And again, I've heard that from family members. I've heard that from, again, friends who I've connected with who are seniors saying, we didn't know if our brothers were coming home. Just that fear, that sheer living on the edge. And so much of history is put on the experience of the veteran and the soldier and people on the front. The home front is often left out. Again, it's a cliche, but the mothers who had to say goodbye to their boy, and again, get the letter, get the telegram that they were lost in service, or just having to become a mother again when the men came home to a totally new generation.
Yeah, I believe it's the Wilson family in Teeterville. I think they lost 3 sons. Oh, wow. in the Second World War. When you watch a movie like Saving Private Ryan, you might think it's pure, Hollywood, but no, there were families, the Sullivans in the United States too had lost all their children on Juneau when it was sank. Mm. I don't have any children. I don't know what it'd be like to lose even one child, but to lose all your children in a conflict like that, that must be an absolutely terrible, terrible thing.
Or I had relatives in the First World War, and thank goodness we have the letters. And having studied the letters, the one gentleman, the brother who is sending the letters, writes home that his brother was killed on the Somme. And at that point, he was back in England suffering a wound. Yeah. And in the letter, it says, I can't wait to get back, basically for revenge, right. To wow. get it for his brother.
Some of our listeners might not know the Battle of the Somme in the First World War, the Great War, as they called it, I think was the worst land battle in the history of the world. It went on for months and months. You talked about being over in Normandy and working for the Legion in Tillsonburg. Now, being from Tillsonburg, I'm assuming that you must have met Mr. Charlie Fox.
Yes.
Tell our listeners the history about Charlie Fox.
I met Charlie Fox on that trip on the 60th anniversary of D-Day. Charlie Fox is a gentleman who was a Canadian pilot, and the claim to fame is he was on reconnaissance when he saw a Nazi staff car driving in France, and he subsequently shot up the car. The car went in the ditch, and he logged it in his logbook, and he flew away. It turned out that staff car was General Rommel's car, and the Desert Fox. And as the story goes, while Rommel was incapacitated and healing, he started to see, well, he'd known before, he saw the war going in the opposite direction right. that he thought it would be. So he then started to be part of the anti-Hitler plots and so on.
The von Stauffenberg
That's
plot,
right.
Yeah, the July 20th plot, they call it. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. I don't know. I've heard different stories about that because I've heard that he didn't know, although the plotters were planning to make him the head of state because they knew that the Western Allies respected him over all of the rest of the German generals or field marshals. Wow. But Field Marshal Rommel was forced to take poison to commit suicide rather than face court-martial.
Yes. And be seen as a traitor.
I've read a lot of different theories. They said that the war or the Battle of Normandy probably would have went a lot differently if Rommel had not been taken out of action. The Germans wouldn't have won probably, but it would have been a totally different outcome, at least in the initial first months after the landings. I just always found that was a very interesting little piece of history from Tillsonburg.
Yeah, sadly, the last time I saw Charlie, he was living in London, and I was visiting a friend, and they lived in the same apartment building. And we had come down, we were going out for lunch, and there was Charlie Fox in his early 80s, sitting at a picnic table trying to mend a radio. Trying to taking out the batteries and fiddling. And again, that's my fascination with history too. So here you have, again, kind of a name in history, and I knew him, and I don't mean to toot my horn, but again, there's my fascination with how history goes. You see a little old man, a old lady, and you don't know their backstory. You realize that they were heroes of the war and so on. So sadly, Charlie Fox, who was a big proponent in the Harvard Association in Tillsonburg, was tragically killed on the way home from one of their meetings. So having talked with my friend Robin Barker James, he remembers Charlie saying that Charlie would die with his boots on. And again, clearly a tragic death, not to make light of it. He
almost kind of appropriate for a guy of his stature, though. If that makes
a fighter
sense.
going down.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and he was in his late 80s, I think, at the time. A lot of Canadians consider what we call VE Day, which is May 8th, to be sort of the symbolic end of the Second World War. And I think that that's mainly because for the vast majority of Canadians, the end of the war in Europe symbolized the end of the fighting for Canada. But that wasn't necessarily true. The other allies, especially the Americans, continued the war all through the summer into August against the Japanese Empire. One of the things that I've always found kind of interesting that most Canadians don't know is that in the days immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was actually the Canadians that were the first ground forces to fight the Japanese in the Battle of Hong Kong. There was 2 regiments of Canadians that were involved in the Battle of Hong Kong. There was the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada. And I never met him, but there was actually a local veteran who had served in the Battle of Hong Kong. His name was Frank Ebden, and he was a British immigrant, and he had originally served in the British Army in India. From the time he was, I think, about 14, 15, he was a bugle boy originally. After his time in the British Army, he and his wife immigrated to Canada, and they settled in Quebec. And when the war broke out, the Second World War, he joined the Royal Rifles of Canada, which were a Quebec-based regiment, and he at that time was he was middle-aged, and he went with the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers to garrison Hong Kong. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked Hong Kong and invaded the island. He was there. He got captured, I think, around Christmas. The battle went from about, I think, December 8th to December 25th. He was he was a company sergeant major, and he was captured. And I've heard the story told that he escaped death because he had served in India. He understood. He was in a hospital in Hong Kong when the Japanese came in. The orderlies that worked in the hospital were all Indian. The Japanese ordered the orderlies to order the patients to remove all their equipment in that. And of course, most of them couldn't understand what they were saying. Well, the Japanese executed every single person that didn't follow the order. Well, Frank survived because he understood. So he was captured and he was taken as a POW to Japan, and he spent the better part of the next 4 years in a POW camp. Apparently, the camp was exactly in between Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, which when you stop to think about that, that's incredible. And this guy ended up settling in Delhi after the war, him and his wife, and he lived here, for like 30 years after the war. I just think that's extraordinary that somebody that went through all that lived here in Norfolk County. That's extraordinary. Now I know he had told my friend that when he got out of the POW camp, he weighed 67 pounds. My grandmother, who was originally from Manitoba, she had known a classmate of hers that had been captured. He had served in the Winnipeg Grenadiers in that same battle. And she said, I remember him coming home and there was just nothing to him.
Did these gentlemen speak about their experiences?
From what I was told, they only spoke about it to close friends, and they never saw themselves as heroes.
Right.
Because, in fact, I've often heard that a lot of them almost felt, I wouldn't say shame, that's not the right word.
Survivor guilt,
yeah. But also because they missed the war, if that makes any sense to you, because this was in the very early days of at least the American involvement in the Pacific. But to sit out the 3 year, and I don't say that lightly. Another good friend of mine, his uncle was a prisoner of war. He was captured in Italy. He was a tanker. And so he was in a POW camp in Germany for about 3 years. And I've read some of his letters that he wrote home to his mother. And it's such an extraordinary thing to see basically a kid. He was 19, 20, 21, something like that, writing a letter home to his mom, or trying to explain just what, and he didn't see himself as a hero. It's just so, like, when I read these letters, I was just like, wow, he didn't see himself as being anything extraordinary. And I don't think the vast majority of veterans in the Second World War did.
No. They
were just doing what they thought they had to do.
And that's exactly it. I remember, and I ask this to all the people who I know who are veterans, who are willing to tell me their stories. And I go, well, what was it like to come home? Like, you had this extraordinary experience. You're, physically or emotionally damaged, and you come home and you live a life and you have children, or you adopt. One of my good friends adopted kids afterwards. And how did you do it? And they all go, but that was my life.
Right.
Like that's just, so again, there's hindsight to history. And I think there's definitely a nostalgia that historians put out there, is that, we look at today, like, what are kids going to say? What are historians going to say 50 years from now with this coronavirus?
Right.
And they look at their elderly companions or relatives and go, well, how did you do it? I go, well, we just did it. We just survived because that is what we do.
It's hard for me to equate this generation with the kind of courage that the quote unquote the greatest generation,
Yes.
brought up in the Depression, which was a horrible, horrible thing around the world,
Yes.
and then go to fight in the Second World War.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to equate.
No, and I'm right on the money with you, 100%. Because without getting negative or, again, stereotyping, but I am going to be negative and stereotype, do I think this younger generation has the gall or the motivation if we were called up? I don't think so. Yeah. We don't live in the same type of country. Again, it's that cliched image. I know many people have saw it on Facebook, and it says, what is it? 1914, 16 years old, on the beaches of France. 2020, your feelings are hurt. Again, not to be negative about youth, but do we have the stamina? Are we teaching students or kids skills?
Well, I think there's definitely a certain cynicism today that never existed back then. But I have to say, to be fair, I think a lot of it has to do with modern communications, modern media. I often wonder, my dad and I have talked about this a few times, if CNN or Fox or CBC or CTV, any of the major networks had a film crew on the beaches of Normandy and been doing live reports of what was happening there, I don't know that there's that old saying, ignorance is bliss. And I think that that was part of the element of the Second World War, is that back home, they didn't really know exactly what kind of carnage was going on. And I'm not saying that, there still wouldn't have been people that would be willing to serve, but I think it would have changed things a little bit, at least on the home front. Of course, in our generation, we've seen, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and we saw it on television.
Yes. And
it was a totally different perspective than they would have had. Back in the Second World War, the newspaper would publish weekly casualties, and you'd see your friend or neighbor's name in the paper, and you would have had no idea before that they had been killed or wounded in action until you saw it in black and white.
And I think that's the hard part, connecting back with what we had said earlier. Growing up in a generation where we knew the veterans, and there were so many of them. Now, because we don't know, and I think we're almost tentative to bring that up, partly because of how much empathy we have for their experience and the trauma that they have faced. The last thing you want to do is walk up to a veteran from Gulf War or Korea, again, even though they're getting older as well, or Afghanistan or wherever, peacekeepers as well, and go, hey, what was it like?
Yeah.
We think we could say that to someone of our generation, but still, we don't. Maybe we shouldn't too.
The whole idea of post-traumatic stress didn't exist back then. It was definitely there. I do think it's a good thing today that people feel that they can talk about their experiences to help them through it. I think that there's a lot more support out there in the community for people, for veterans, and not only veterans, first responders too, that are suffering from post-traumatic stress. I can't even imagine some of the things that they must have experienced. And then to come home and be quiet about it for the rest of your life while raising, a family and doing your job every day. I don't know where that mental toughness comes from, because I can tell you right now, I don't have it. I don't think.
No, we can't discount the negativity that came home with the veterans. We know that there was, alcoholism, abuse in families, and so on. But I think because that's a family household issue that wasn't spread around. They, of course, as we know, they built the Legion shortly after the First World War so that veterans would have a community. It was their place. That's where they gathered. And again, we saw that up until the mid-2000s with the acceptance of new membership. You had to be a veteran to be part of the Legion, or you had to be an associate and so on. In the Second World War, interestingly enough, some of my veteran friends from the Second World War had said they were turned off by the idea of becoming part of the Legion because of the stereotype.
Right.
It was a place where old, grizzled men drank too much and smoked too much. They were crude. It wasn't an inviting atmosphere, and they were afraid to be part of it as well, until they became part of it, again, because it was the post-war years, and they really made it their own. And again, communities were built through the legions. My aunt's father was part of the Legion in Tillsonburg and helped build the Legion where it is now on Durham Street.
This is the current Legion in Tillsonburg?
Yes.
Yeah.
And her mother was there every Friday back when they did meals every Friday. That was a community thing. It was just a normal thing. Every Friday you were at the Legion. Her mother Rita was peeling potatoes every week. That was just part of it. And as we have seen the Legion go through different challenges in terms of the age, membership, and generation, it has become much more of a community organization than a kind of like a fraternal kind of club. But that's what communities need as well. They need somewhere to host, a banquet or a do or a funeral. And, it really is a community aspect nowadays.
I was kind of saddened to read recently in the press that because of the COVID crisis and pandemic, that they're saying there's going to be a number of Legion branches across Canada that will probably close permanently.
Yes.
I know there's been a number of them that have been struggling anyways before all this happened. That's got to make you sad as a longtime member of the Legion.
It's a reality, and I think that's the way we have to look at it as well. Because we are losing veterans, the leaders in many of the Legions now are elderly, so they're in their 70s and 80s, and they are the children of Second World War veterans.
Right, yeah. That's kind of hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
Yeah. So here I am. I'm 40 years old, and I'm a new member, so to speak. Like, I'm one of the youngest.
You're one of the kids.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I enjoy my time there. And you're right. It's for the last several months, they've been closed. And average, when you pay $3,000 a month, hydro, cable, telephone, just to keep an empty building running, how do you do it? And we will. You're absolutely right. We are going to see a lot of places close out of necessity, not out of want.
We should talk to our listeners about, so September 2nd, today is the anniversary. Just looking back at the history, I know that there was 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan. And you were mentioning earlier, one on the 6th?
Yes.
And one on the 9th.
Yes.
Hiroshima was the first.
Yes.
And Nagasaki was the second. I've read a lot about the Manhattan Project and how it all came about. What a lot of people might not realize is that when they created the atomic weapons, they created 3 bombs. One to test. I think it was in July 1945, they tested it in the desert in New Mexico. Then they had 2 more, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After that, they didn't have any. They were really unsure about what was going to happen if the Japanese didn't surrender after the second bomb. Then they were going to have to go back to Plan A and launch a conventional invasion of the Japanese home islands. And I got to tell you, even the most optimistic planners thought it was going to be just sheer carnage based upon the experiences that they had had in Okinawa, in Iwo Jima, and some of the other island battles that they had in the Pacific. I've heard the number quoted, 1 million casualties. That's what they were expecting. And one of the things I've read that just totally blew my mind is that up until a few years ago, and I would say about 10 years ago, every single one of the Purple Hearts that's been awarded to American service members, and that's all through Korea, Vietnam, both Gulf Wars, in Afghanistan, and all the other military operations they had, all of the Purple Hearts that were awarded were from the batch that they made in 1945 in anticipation of the casualties that they were going to have going into Japan. There was 500,000 Purple Hearts that they had made. And I think it was up until 2010 before they had to start making more. But that was what they were anticipating. They said that, there was something about the Japanese Bushido Code that was not going to allow them to surrender. The idea that they were going to have to launch a conventional invasion of Japan just, it terrified the planners, the Allies. Now, there was supposed to be, in the original plans, there was supposed to be a Canadian division that was going to be equipped to go in. And, of course, that never came to fruition because the nuclear bombs ended that. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. There's been a lot of thinking the last few years, maybe in revisionist history, but there's been a lot of thinking that the Americans dropped the atomic bombs more to scare the Soviets than they did to bring Japan to their knees. I don't know. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I've always been under the assumption that it was a last-ditch effort. I'm not a big historian on the Pacific Campaign, but I have read a lot about Truman and how he's kind of backed into a corner. And so, yeah, VE Day is kind of the monumental day. And again,
in Canada, yeah.
And as an educator, I think it's challenging too, because when you get to VE Day, that's where the chapter ends in the book.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
we totally
as far
forget,
as Canada is concerned, yes.
Yeah, we totally forget about the rest of the Pacific campaign. And then you're right, we go right into the Cold War. Again, it's so hard when you look through history with hindsight. You know, if they had have held off, would there have been the carnage? Would there have been, again, the invasion of Japan? How would that have turned out? You know, a lot of people look at it as a humanitarian aspect today. How many people were innocently killed because of those bombs? You know, and who are still suffering today. And I think that's something that should be spoken about more as well. But yeah, you know, the whole Soviet side too. You know, it's Teddy Roosevelt, you know, walk softly but carry a big stick.
Yeah, the dynamics changed in the last months of the war because of, Franklin Roosevelt had died just as Germany was being defeated. And then in July of 1945, Winston Churchill was defeated at the polls. So you had the two major Western players were all of a sudden not on the scene anymore. So Stalin was the only one that still remained. And I think that was a big factor too. You know, I've read Churchill's 6-volume history of the Second World War. And he talks about how he could see the beginnings of the Cold War in the last months of the Second World War. And a history teacher of mine told me many years ago to when you think critically, that the reason that Canada got in the war in the first place, September 10th, 1939, was to liberate Poland from the Germans. And at the end of the war, not only was Poland, but all of Eastern Europe was under the control of the Soviets. So it begs the question, what did we do this all for? Franklin Roosevelt, when they met at the Yalta Conference, and I think it was in February 45, he was desperate to get the Soviets involved with the war in Japan, because he knew that the Americans probably couldn't do it alone, even with the British and Canadians helping them. So he was desperate to bring the Soviets on board, and so he made a lot of concessions to them. And so, I think the Soviets got involved in the war against Japan, and a week before the end of the war or something. It was very late in the game. But a lot of revisionist historians have a problem with that, because it basically led to the Cold War, and there was really no reason to do it. If you had atomic weapons, why bargain with the Soviets, right? But that goes back to what I was saying earlier about there's that theory that they were basically using them to scare off the Soviets. I don't know. I think there's some truth to that, probably. I know that Winston Churchill was absolutely convinced. He was terrified of what the post-war world was going to look like, with the Soviets controlling a huge area of Europe. And he knew that the next phase was going to be a standoff between the Western Allies and the Soviets, right? I don't know, it's really interesting. The roots of the Cold War came about in those last 6 months or so before the end of the Second World War. What do you think, just based on your observances and that from your study of history and that, how do you think that the world might have looked a little bit differently, say, if the Soviets hadn't had the huge influence that they did at the end of the Second World War? I
think that's the interesting part of looking back. It's all the what ifs, right? And we used to play this game. I used to be part of the Tilsonburg Military History Club. And we, at the end of every evening, we had a what if. Okay. So again, it's the classic, what if Hitler died in 39? Right. Or what if he died in jail in 27 or whatever?
Right. Yep.
What would happen if Roosevelt stayed alive, right? And we ultimately came up with some really good questions, and it would just lead those kind of those inquiries ongoing. Something I wanted to touch on is the idea of leadership. I think that's a major factor. Not to get into today's context, because there's not enough time or patience for that today, but it's all about it. Everything is a 50-50. If Roosevelt lived, would there have been the bomb? Would he have done it? If Canada had waited a little bit longer in September, what are all the different implications?
Truman didn't even know about the existence of the atomic bombs until Roosevelt died, and he was the vice president. That's how secret it was. He gets thrown in there, and on day one, they're like, "Well, do you want to use this new weapon that we have?" I can't even fathom how much pressure that would have been on him. A guy that was a haberdasher. That's what he did before he went into politics. But I've read too that there was a group of scientists in the United States that were actually really scared of even testing the atomic bomb, because there was a theory amongst the scientific community in the United States that it might start off a chain reaction that would set the whole atmosphere on fire.
Wow.
and yet they just went ahead and did it anyways.
Yep.
And that, to me, like, when you put it in that perspective, I mean, it led to so many advances later on with atomic energy and things like that, but just, basically they're harnessing this new weapon, and they themselves don't even have any concept of how destructive it's going to be.
But isn't that the history of warfare?
It is,
too.
absolutely.
Like, that is what we saw in the First World War. And thank the Lord we don't have gas attacks now, although we've been fearing that through Syria and so on for the last 10 years.
Yep.
But you're absolutely right. Like, again, the technology that's born out of conflict and tested out of conflict.
It says something that Hitler would not allow his guys to use gas because he had been gassed himself in the First World War. And, okay, so if it's something that's so bad that even Hitler won't use it, then you got to stop and think about,
I think that is the definition of double standard.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. There's the irrational nature of war, give an inch and take a mile aspect. And then there's it's the hand on the stove, kind of like we already know what this is about and this is what we have to learn from this. Everything's a 50-50. And I know that's a cheap answer. It's a terrible answer. But we make those decisions all the time. And I think that's the difficult part of looking at history in a contemporary sense, like what is happening today, because we can't see further than the nose in our face.
Do you notice any correlation in those sort of feelings of veterans who were conscripted versus veterans who voluntarily signed up?
I've never met someone who was conscripted, so I can't speak to that. But I always go back to World War I and the Second World War, the Quebec conscriptors, where, again, you are literally fighting for something that you don't believe in. So I've always been fascinated by kind of the French-Canadian point of view. But it really does touch on the idea of, why are you making me go? This is not a cause that I want to fight for. And it goes back to what we had said earlier about young people today. I think we would have a harder time today with conscription than they did then. I think we live in a...
Everyone would be getting medical exemptions and any way out.
Absolutely. We would definitely have that, but I think we also live in a time where we know the implications of conflict. And our generation has been bred and born up to this idea that conflict is a negative thing, for the most part. I have friends who come from military families, and that is their lot in life, and they believe that. Their father was in the military and their grandfather and so on and so on. So they feel it's their duty to perpetuate that. But I come from a family of pacifists. So, if I was conscripted, I would fight that.
Do you have any comment on, the comparison between the World War I and World War II veterans versus the veterans of today? And are there any stereotypes that you feel are like really important that we need to break when we think of veterans?
It's based on age. I am more apt to be respectful to a senior citizen than I am a younger person. When you hear that person is a veteran, you give your head a shake and your perception changes. And I think you're right. We do see someone who is old as a hero. Oh, you survived. Oh, you made it. And I think that's just hard to see someone who's in their 20s. I had a wonderful meeting a handful of years ago with a young gentleman who had served, I think, 3 tours in Afghanistan. And he was literally 10 years younger than me. And I thought, the things that you have been through just put me in awe. So when I saw him and I met with him, again, I had the respect, clearly, that you would give a veteran. But I also think, and this is kind of hippie as well, you have to treat everybody with respect. This day and age, I think we are also taught, we don't know everybody's backstory. We have to kind of continually have that positivity. In terms of stereotypes, I always go back to the movies. I'm a movie buff. And there's so much when you look at war movies. It's all about the soldier. Those are what war movies are about. We have the offshoots, we have the medics, we have the chaplains, we have the cooks, the drivers, all those kind of things that make up this idea of war and conflict history. But the stereotype is looking at a soldier. My grandfather was a soldier in Second World War. And what did I think about that? Because he never talked about it. I thought, oh man, he was fighting. He was on the front. He had a gun. He was a truck driver. I'm not downplaying that by any means. In fact, it gave me a better idea of his role because he wasn't a frontline soldier. And I think that's the biggest stereotype that we have to teach kids. history is about all types, looking at it like a quilt. So yes, there were soldiers, but there were also, again, cooks and drivers. And then, of course, the people who are connected with that, the families at home, the brothers who didn't go away, who were too young, or, the wives when they came home or the wives when they went away. There are just so many factors.
Do you guys find a lot of the modern soldiers engaging with the legions when they come home?
No, they don't. From my experience. I do not know anybody in our legion who is of a recent conflict. I do know there was a challenge in a neighboring community between the official legion and then new veterans. They didn't want to be part of the old regime, so to speak. It wasn't that they didn't feel like they were part of it, but they felt that they wanted something that was uniquely their own.
Do you think that's because of a change in the warfare or the area where they're fighting, that they just can't identify with each other? Or
because, like I said earlier, a legion is inclusive nowadays. So there's no reason for someone to feel uncomfortable about becoming a member and being supported, especially with the direct connection that a legion will have and can have with veterans and the needs of that veteran and their families. And I'm speculating here. Maybe it is that too. Maybe it's they just didn't feel like sitting around with older folks. They wanted a younger crowd. They wanted to be part of a group that had similar experiences. And again, coming from Korean War to Afghanistan is such a jump in time and place and generation and experience. But to be honest, like I said, I don't know exactly why they wanted their own scene. But I don't discount that either. I respect that as well. A veteran can call the Legion and inquire. That's the key. If they are not connected with their local Veterans Affairs office, they can always call the Legion, your local Legion, and inquire about supports. That is always available. And it's also the families of veterans as well. So you have an elderly couple, one of them is a veteran and they pass away. The spouse can access supports as well. Or again, a young couple, don't get me wrong. Again, there's that stereotype. So it's really about the support aspect. And it literally is a phone call that people have to make. Again, on the same trip to the 60th anniversary of DDay, I was walking along Juno Beach with another veteran who I had gotten to know. And he said, "Would you like to hear my story about coming on the beach?" And of course, I'm not going to say no. So I said, "Sure." And we were walking really slowly. It was kind of hard to walk because you're walking on sand. And he says he came in 12 days after D-Day. And he said everything was being unloaded. And he says you get into the water and then you walk up on the beach and you have a hard time. And we were told not to pick anything up off the beach. That was the number one thing that they said. They said, go from transport right to where you need to be. And he said, I was walking beside somebody who saw something in the sand and he decided he was going to pick it up. And it was a landmine. He said, and that man was gone. And he said, that was my introduction to France. It's tough telling these stories because it was somebody's experience. You don't want to minimize that experience, but you also don't want to look at it as a stereotype because there is your stereotype. Another gentleman had said they were in a firefight back and forth and they had jumped into a barn to get out of the shelling. And he said within seconds, he rolled over to see his buddy next to him. And again, there is a piece of shrapnel right in the guy's head. And again, I don't glorify these stories. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge is what movies do. They glorify the gore. They glorify the death. And that gentleman, he told me, he said he was traumatized for the rest of his experience to the point where he went to his commanding officer asking if he could drive the ammunition truck. So he did mortar shells. The officer, knowing that he was in such despair, said, no, I'm not going to give you an out. Because that was, again, high risk. You drive the mortar shells somewhere, if that hits, you're game over. He came home, he married, again, had children, adopted children. When I knew him in his early 80s, he confided in me. He said, I'll tell you what, I don't know what it's been, but for the last year, I've been having nightmares. He says, I came home after war, nothing. He goes, here I am, I'm an old man, the end of my life, and I'm now having nightmares about my experience. So he went and he sought help. And he went and he had a therapist and talked about the things. He went to Parkwood Hospital in London, which is a fantastic facility for veterans. But he was so astonished by that. But to his credit, he also said in the last 5 to 10 years, that was the first time he was vocal about his experience.
And so today, on September 2nd, we hope that you will take the time to appreciate and educate yourself on the unique history of Norfolk County during World War II, and to also consider the veterans of yesterday and today and the ultimate sacrifice that they're willing to make.
Thank you very much for having me as a guest. It's been a pleasure to talk about my experiences and my point of view. And as always, I suggest that people get involved with local history and cultural initiatives in their communities. Support the Legion, support your veterans, and let them know that they have supports for them. And again, just get those stories before they're lost. That is a very, very important part of history, not just the saving of history, but the passing down of history as well.